Welcome to the Sleeping Archive, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it.
Is Irina Volkov, and I am 15 years old. It is October 1976, and the leaves outside our Kommunalka apartment have turned the color of old kopecks, brown and tarnished, clinging desperately to branches before the Leningrad wind tears them away. I share this story now because silence, I have learned, becomes heavier with each passing year, and some truths demand to be whispered into the darkness, even if only to the shadows that listen. Our apartment building on Nevsky Prospect stands like a tired sentinel, its pre-revolutionary facade cracked and stained from decades of Soviet winters. The Kommunalka houses 6 families, and we all share the same kitchen, the same bathroom, the same careful dance of avoiding each other's secrets. My mother, Vera Nikolaevna, works at the Kirov factory, her hands permanently stained with machine oil. My father died in the war when I was 3, one of the 27 million who fell for the motherland, though we rarely speak of such numbers openly. Each morning begins the same way. The communal alarm clock, a battered Slava timepiece that belonged to the Petrovs before they moved to Moscow, rings at 6:30. The sound echoes through thin walls, waking us all in sequence like dominoes falling. I dress in my school uniform, brown wool dress, white apron, red pioneer scarf tied just so. The mirror above our small sink reflects a face I'm still learning to recognize. Sharp Slavic cheekbones like my grandmother's. Dark eyes that my mother says hold too much curiosity for my own good. The walk to school number 47 takes 23 minutes through streets that seem carved from granite and shadow. Past the bread queue that forms before dawn at bakery number 12. Past the pharmacy where Babushka Semenova sells herbal remedies from jars hidden beneath the counter, past the statue of Lenin, whose bronze finger points eternally toward a future that feels both distant and oppressive. My best friend Mikhail, Misha, meets me at the corner of Legovsky Prospect every morning at 7:15. He is 16, a year older, with wire-rimmed glasses that fog in the cold and a worn copy of War and Peace always tucked under his arm. His father is an engineer at the Baltic shipyard. His mother teaches kindergarten. They are what we call good Soviet citizens, careful, quiet, unremarkable in all the ways that matter for survival. But Misha and I share a secret hunger that gnaws at us both. We are starving for words that sing, for thoughts that dance, for poetry that makes the heart race instead of recite approved verses about tractors and 5-year plans. Did you finish the Pushkin essay? He asks this particular morning, his breath creating small clouds in the October air. The assignment for literature class is to analyze Eugene Onegin through the lens of socialist realism, to find revolutionary consciousness in romantic verses written 50 years before Marx was born. I wrote what Comrade Fedorov wants to hear, I reply, adjusting my school bag. Inside, hidden between geometry notes and a propaganda leaflet about the latest wheat harvest figures, lies a small notebook bound in black cloth. This notebook contains something far more dangerous than any weapon, poems copied in my careful handwriting, verses that exist in the shadows between official culture and the human heart. Our literature teacher, Comrade Fedorov, is a small, nervous man who jumps at unexpected sounds and whose lessons follow the approved curriculum with religious devotion. He teaches us that Soviet literature began with Maxim Gorky and reached its pinnacle with novels about collective farms and industrial progress. He does not speak of Anna Akhmatova's Requiem, though rumors whisper that he once owned a samizdat copy before burning it during the purges of 1968. But it was not from Comrade Fedorov that I learned about the power of forbidden words. It was from my grandmother, Babushka Elena, before she died 2 winters ago. Babushka Elena lived in a single room in our kommunalka, surrounded by icons hidden behind portraits of Lenin and small treasures saved from before the revolution. A silver tea glass holder, a book of Pushkin's fairy tales, with illustrations in gold leaf, a shawl embroidered with patterns that told stories of old Russia. On cold evenings, when the heating failed and the adults gathered in the kitchen to discuss ration cards and work quotas, she would call me to her room, and we would sit together on her narrow bed, sharing tea from the silver glass holder while she recited poetry from memory. "Words have their own life, little dove," she would whisper, her voice barely audible above the wind rattling our windows. "They survive when buildings crumble, when governments fall, when those who wrote them are forgotten. But someone must remember. Someone must keep them alive, and so she taught me verses that were not in any approved anthology. Poems by Osip Mandelstam, who died in a transit camp for writing 16 lines about Stalin. Lines from Anna Akhmatova, who burned her poems after memorizing them to keep them from the secret police. Fragments of Nikolai Gumilev, shot in 1921 for alleged counter-revolutionary activities. Boris Pasternak, whose Dr. Zhivago could not be published in our country but won the Nobel Prize in capitalist Stockholm. After Babushka Elena's funeral, I began copying these poems into my black notebook, adding new ones as I discovered them. A line overheard in the university district, where students sometimes gather in the shadows between buildings to share more than cigarettes and complaints about dormitory food. A verse whispered by the librarian at the Saltykov-Shchedrin Library, who sometimes slips banned books beneath approved texts for those who know how to ask. Fragments remembered by my mother's friend Lyudmila, who worked as a translator before her husband was arrested in 1968 for possessing foreign literature. The notebook became my most precious possession, more valuable than the silver bracelet my mother inherited from her grandmother, more precious than the foreign chocolate that sometimes appears in the closed stores accessible only to party members. I carried it everywhere, hidden inside my school bag like a talisman against the gray uniformity of our prescribed lives. The moment I decided to share my notebook with Misha came on a gray Thursday in early November. We were walking home from school, past the queue at the state store where citizens waited patiently for whatever goods might be available. Perhaps canned fish from the Baltic. Perhaps synthetic fabric that felt like sandpaper against the skin. Perhaps nothing at all except the promise of participation in our planned economy. The day had been particularly oppressive. During history class, we had studied the latest 5-year plan, memorizing production statistics and celebrating the triumph of collective agriculture. During literature, we had analyzed a poem about the beauty of factory smokestacks, finding metaphors for industrial progress in descriptions of steel and concrete. During civics, we had discussed the moral superiority of our social system, the inevitable victory of socialism over the decadent capitalist West. "Do you ever feel," Misha said quietly as we passed a group of young pioneers practicing their marching formation in a courtyard, "that we are being fed sawdust and told it is bread?" I stopped walking and looked at him carefully. We had been friends since childhood, but there are words that, once spoken, change the nature of friendship forever. His question hung in the cold air between us like a bridge I could either cross or pretend not to see. "Sometimes," I whispered, "I wonder what real bread tastes like." He understood. That evening, in the small park behind the Kazan Cathedral, as darkness fell early and the streetlights cast long shadows between the leafless trees, I opened my black notebook for the first time to another person. "Listen," I said, my voice barely audible above the sound of wind through bare branches. And I read to him the words that had sustained me through months of gray propaganda and approved thoughts. "I have learned to live simply, wisely, to look up at the sky and pray to God, and to wander long before evening to tire my superfluous worries." The lines were from Anna Akhmatova, written decades before, but carrying the weight of eternal truth. Misha's eyes widened behind his glasses, not from shock, but from recognition, the look of someone dying of thirst who suddenly discovers water. Our ritual began that night. 3 times a week, after school, we would meet in different locations around the city, sometimes in the summer garden, when weather permitted, sitting on benches dedicated to heroes of the Great Patriotic War while I read verses that those heroes died to protect. Sometimes in the basement of the old church that had been converted to a storage facility where the echoes of forgotten prayers seemed to bless our whispered recitations. Sometimes in the maze of courtyards behind the university where students had been sharing forbidden knowledge for centuries. I would read and Misha would listen with the intensity of a starving man consuming his first meal. Then we would discuss the poems, not analyzing them for hidden political meanings like our literature classes demanded, but simply experiencing them as human beings, hungry for beauty, for truth, for words that acknowledged the complexity of existence beyond propaganda slogans. Kitchen for warmth, our breath visible in the lamplight as we shared stories and preserves and the careful silences that bind Soviet citizens together in survival. But for Misha and me, winter brought something else, the deep satisfaction of tending to our growing collection of forbidden words. By January, we each possessed 3 notebooks filled with carefully copied verses. The poems had become part of our daily rhythm, like prayers or breathing. During the long darkness of the polar winter, when the sun appeared for barely 6 hours a day and the cold penetrated even our thickest coats, we would meet in the warmth of the public library and read to each other in whispers between the stacks of approved literature. The answer to finding others came unexpectedly through my mother's friend, Lyudmila Sergeyevna. She worked as a night shift cleaner at the university, a job that brought her into contact with students and faculty during their most unguarded moments. One evening in February, as she shared tea with my mother in our small kitchen while the other families slept, she mentioned something that made my heart race. "There are students," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure we weren't overheard, "who meet in the basement of the philosophy building. They call it a study group, but..." She shrugged, the gesture saying everything that words could not safely express. The philosophy building at Leningrad State University squatted like a gray fortress on Vasilyevsky Island, its windows glowing dimly in the March twilight as Misha and I approached for our first clandestine meeting with the student group. My heart hammered against my ribs so loudly I was certain the militiaman directing traffic at the corner could hear it. In my school bag, wrapped in a scarf to muffle any sound, lay my most precious notebook, the one containing the poems I had never shared with anyone except Misha. The basement smelled of dust and old books with an underlying dampness that spoke of Leningrad winters seeping through foundation stones. The storage room door bore a small sign reading, "Maintenance supplies, authorized personnel only." Misha and I exchanged a final glance, and he knocked as instructed, 3 times softly, then twice more. The door opened to reveal a young woman with short blonde hair and intelligent green eyes. She was perhaps 19 or 20, wearing the practical sweater and skirt of a university student. You are the ones Lyudmila mentioned? She asked quietly. I am Marina. Marina Vladimirovna, come in. The storage room had been transformed into a strange sort of sanctuary. Old desks formed a rough circle, with chairs salvaged from various university departments. A small electric heater glowed in one corner, its warmth barely adequate against the basement chill. Perhaps a dozen students sat around the improvised classroom, their faces illuminated by the soft light of a single desk lamp. We are discussing Pasternak tonight, Marina said as she guided us to empty chairs. Not the approved poems about nature and revolution, but the verses that were never published in our country. The discussion that followed was unlike anything I had experienced in all my years of Soviet education. Instead of searching for approved political meanings or predetermined interpretations, these students talked about poetry as living truth, as windows into the complexity of human experience that transcended state ideology. When Marina asked if Misha and I had anything to contribute, I felt a moment of pure terror. What could a 15-year-old schoolgirl offer to these sophisticated university students? But then I remembered my grandmother's words about the life of literature. I have some poems, I said quietly, that my grandmother taught me before she died. They might not be in any of the books you've mentioned, but they feel true to me. With trembling hands, I opened my notebook and found a poem by Anna Akhmatova that had lived in my grandmother's memory for decades. When a man dies, his portraits change, his eyes look differently, his lips smile a different smile. The silence that followed was the silence of people recognizing something they had felt but never heard expressed. Through the student group, our understanding of underground literature expanded exponentially. We learned about the vast network of samizdat, self-published literature that circulated in carbon copies and hand-typed manuscripts throughout the Soviet Union. We discovered works by Varlam Shalamov about life in the Gulag, essays by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, poems by Joseph Brodsky written in exile but smuggled back to circulate among those who remembered why beauty mattered. Victor, a thin student with prematurely gray hair, worked as a typist for various university departments and had access to copying equipment. In exchange for our contributions, the poems I had preserved from my grandmother's memory, he provided us with typed copies of longer works. The key to survival, Marina explained during one of our meetings, is understanding that we are not dissidents in the political sense. We are preservers of culture. We maintain libraries that exist only in memory and friendship. But even as our circle grew more confident, the risks became more apparent. In April, a philosophy student at Moscow University was expelled for possessing samizdat literature. In May, a group of young poets in Kiev were arrested for organizing informal readings of unauthorized verse. Sometimes I feel like I'm living two lives, Misha confided one evening as we walked along the Neva River. The approved life that everyone can see and the real life that exists only in the spaces between what I'm allowed to say. Each new text felt like liberation and burden simultaneously. Liberation from the intellectual poverty of approved literature, burden of carrying knowledge that could not be safely shared beyond our careful circle of trusted friends. The white nights of Leningrad summer arrived in June like a promise that never quite delivers on its hope. For 24 hours each day, a pale sun circled the horizon, creating a dreamlike twilight that made the city feel suspended between reality and imagination. It was during these endless bright nights that our underground literary circle began to feel the first real pressure from the authorities The warning came through Lyudmila. A maintenance worker at the university had mentioned increased security checks in the philosophy building. New locks had been installed on basement storage rooms. Questions were being asked about unusual evening activities. The student group adapted with the fluid caution of people accustomed to surveillance. Instead of regular Thursday meetings in the university basement, we began gathering in different locations, sometimes in Marina's small apartment near the Smolny Institute, sometimes in Victor's communal flat, occasionally in the reading room of the public library where conversations about literature could hide among approved scholarly activities. But the change in location brought new dangers. Moving our activities into private apartments meant exposing families to risk they had not chosen. Carrying forbidden books and notebooks through the streets during the paranoid summer of 1976 required constant vigilance. Misha and I developed elaborate precautions for transporting our literary treasures. We created fake covers for sensitive books, disguising samizdat poetry collections as approved textbooks. We memorized key passages so that physical copies could be destroyed if necessary. We established code words for discussing dangerous topics in public. The Gray collection is expanding, Misha might say, referring to our growing archive of banned literature. I found 3 new examples of pre-revolutionary methodology, meaning poems by authors who had died in Stalin's camps. The psychological pressure was particularly intense for Misha, whose natural enthusiasm sometimes overcame his caution. During a discussion in literature class about 19th century writers, he made a comment about the suppressed tradition in Russian verse that was both accurate and dangerously revealing. "What do you mean by suppressed tradition, Comrade Petrov?" Comrade Fedorov asked, his small eyes focusing on Misha with uncomfortable intensity. I held my breath, watching my friend struggle to transform his authentic insight into acceptable classroom discourse. "I mean the tradition of folk poetry and religious verse that our great Soviet writers have transformed into secular, progressive themes," Misha replied carefully. It was a skillful recovery, but I could see the sweat on his forehead, the slight tremor in his hands as he realized how close he had come to revealing the depth of his forbidden knowledge. The break in our circle came suddenly, as such breaks always do, through a combination of bad luck, human weakness, and the inexorable logic of authoritarian surveillance. In early July, Victor was arrested during a random document check on Nevsky Prospect. In his briefcase, militia officers found carbon copies of poems by Joseph Brodsky and an essay by Andrei Sakharov. Victor was experienced in dealing with authorities and had established cover stories for possessing questionable literature, research for an approved thesis on the evolution of Soviet poetry, analysis of counter-revolutionary themes for purposes of ideological criticism. But his arrest meant that his apartment would be searched, his associates investigated, his entire network of literary contacts exposed to official scrutiny. Marina called an emergency meeting for the following evening, not in her apartment, but in a small park near the Finland station. The 8 remaining members of our group gathered on benches beneath linden trees whose leaves filtered the endless summer light into patterns of green shadow and pale gold illumination. "We must assume they know everything Victor knew," Marina said quietly, her usual confidence replaced by grim calculation. "Everyone he mentioned, every meeting he attended, every book he helped distribute. The safe assumption is that we are all compromised." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of fear through our small circle. 2 younger students immediately announced they were withdrawing from the group permanently. The careful network we had built over months of cautious trust was dissolving in real time. "What about the notebooks?" asked a literature student named Dmitri. "The copies we've made, the poems we've transcribed?" "Burn them," Marina replied without hesitation. Tonight, all physical evidence must disappear. I felt something die inside my chest. The black notebook that contained my grandmother's legacy, the carefully copied verses that had sustained me through gray months of ideological conformity, all of it condemned to fire by the necessities of survival. But Misha surprised me by shaking his head. Not everything, he said quietly. Some things are too important to destroy. Some poems exist only in the copies we've made. If we burn everything, entire works could disappear forever. Marina looked at him with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. Mikhail, sentiment is a luxury we cannot afford. Better that poems disappear than that we disappear. Then what was the point? Misha asked, his voice rising slightly. What was the point of preserving these words if we abandon them the moment preservation becomes dangerous? Within a week, our carefully constructed network had effectively ceased to exist. Marina left Leningrad for her grandmother's village in the Urals. Other members burned their collections or withdrew from all literary discussions. But Misha and I made a different choice. Instead of abandoning our literary treasures entirely, we decided to preserve the most essential works through the method my grandmother had taught me: memorization. We would burn the physical evidence but maintain libraries in our hearts and minds. August brought news that Victor had been sentenced to 3 years in a corrective labor camp for possession and distribution of anti-Soviet materials. The sentence was relatively light, suggesting either that authorities considered him a minor figure or that he had provided information about his associates in exchange for reduced punishment. The uncertainty about what Victor might have revealed created an atmosphere of paranoid speculation. Had he mentioned Misha and me by name? Did the authorities know about our school notebooks and our regular attendance at the basement meetings? In September, as we began our final year of secondary school, several changes in our educational environment suggested increased political scrutiny. A new deputy director was appointed to oversee ideological education. Literature classes began incorporating more explicit discussions of the moral dangers posed by Western cultural influence. Students were encouraged to report conversations that revealed unhealthy interest in non-Soviet authors. Most disturbing was the introduction of individual counseling sessions with the school's Communist Party representative, Comrade Volkov, a middle-aged woman whose husband worked for the regional security apparatus and who had a reputation for extracting information from students through a combination of maternal warmth and subtle intimidation. When my turn came for these counseling sessions, I found myself sitting across from a woman who smiled frequently but whose eyes remained cold and calculating. She asked about my family background, my academic interests, my plans for university study. Then, seemingly casually, she inquired about my extracurricular reading. "I understand you are particularly interested in literature, Irina Petrovna," she said, consulting a file that presumably contained my academic records and perhaps other information as well. "What authors have impressed you most?" The question felt like stepping onto ice of unknown thickness. "I have been most inspired by Mayakovsky's revolutionary poetry," I replied, choosing an author who was both officially celebrated and genuinely talented. Comrade Volkov nodded approvingly and made notes in my file. "And what about your friend Mikhail Petrov? What are his literary preferences?" The mention of Misha's name sent alarm signals through every nerve in my body. If they were asking about his reading habits, it suggested they had some reason to suspect him of ideological deviation. "Mikhail also admires Mayakovsky," I said carefully. "We often discuss the technical aspects of Soviet poetry. Has he ever expressed interest in non-Soviet authors? Academic curiosity about Western literature, perhaps? Or research into pre-revolutionary poets?" The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to be sprung. I could sense that Comrade Volkov already knew something about Misha's interests, that she was testing my willingness to corroborate information she had obtained elsewhere. "We sometimes read Pushkin and Lermontov for school assignments," I said finally. "Classical literature that helps us understand the historical development of Russian poetry." It was a safe answer, technically true, but revealing nothing about our underground activities. But as I left her office, I understood that our situation had fundamentally changed. We were no longer anonymous students pursuing private literary interests. We had come to official attention, were being actively monitored, perhaps being prepared for more serious investigation. That evening, I told Misha about my conversation with Comrade Volkov. His face went pale when I described the specific questions about his reading habits. "They know," he said quietly. "Somehow, they know about the notebooks, about the meetings, about everything we've been doing." October arrived with the cruel beauty that marks Leningrad autumns. Leaves turning gold and red against gray stone facades, early snow dusting the bridges across the Neva, the light growing shorter each day as winter approached with its familiar promise of endurance and survival. But for Misha and me, the changing season brought not beauty, but mounting psychological pressure that transformed our final year of secondary school into an exercise in sustained terror. The individual counseling sessions with Comrade Volkov continued throughout September, each conversation probing deeper into our reading habits, our friendships, our private thoughts about literature and society. Other students reported similar interrogations, creating an atmosphere of mutual suspicion that poisoned the simple pleasures of academic life. Misha's anxiety reached levels that interfered with his ability to function normally. He lost weight, developed a nervous tic that made his left eye twitch during stressful conversations, and began avoiding the public library entirely for fear that his reading selections were being monitored. His academic performance, previously excellent, declined noticeably as he struggled to concentrate on approved coursework while carrying the weight of memorized forbidden poetry. "I can't sleep," he confided one evening as we walked through the Alexander Garden, past monuments to heroes whose sacrifices had purchased the right to live in a society where curiosity itself was dangerous. "Every night I lie awake reciting Akhmatova's Requiem, and every morning I wake up terrified that I talked in my sleep, that my mother heard me." I tried to reassure him, but my own confidence was dissolving under similar pressures. The memorized verses that had once felt like precious treasures now seemed like bombs waiting to explode, destroying not only ourselves, but anyone who might be implicated in our underground literary activities. The crisis came in mid-October during a routine literature class discussion of contemporary Soviet poetry. Comrade Fedorov was leading us through an analysis of verses celebrating the latest agricultural achievements when he made a comment about the simple honesty of approved themes compared to the decadent complexity of bourgeois literature. Misha's hand shot up before he could stop himself. "But isn't complexity sometimes necessary to express complex truths?" he asked. "Doesn't reducing all poetry to simple themes risk losing the depth that makes literature meaningful?" The classroom fell silent. Comrade Fedorov's face flushed red above his collar, and I could feel 30 pairs of eyes turning to watch Misha as he realized he had crossed a line from which there might be no return. "Complex truths, Comrade Petrov?" Fedorov's voice was dangerously quiet. "Are you suggesting that our contemporary poets are incapable of expressing truth in accessible forms?" Misha tried to recover, stumbling through an explanation about technical sophistication that only made his original comment seem more suspicious. Everyone in the room understood that he had revealed knowledge and opinions that extended far beyond approved classroom discussions. After class, several students avoided us entirely, while others made pointed comments about the dangers of intellectual showing off. I could see the word dangerous beginning to attach itself to our friendship, creating a social isolation that would make us more vulnerable to official attention. That afternoon, Misha was called to meet privately with Comrade Volkov. I waited for Misha outside the school building, watching through windows as afternoon shadows lengthened across the courtyard where young pioneers practiced their formations with military precision. The meeting with Comrade Volkov lasted nearly 2 hours, far longer than any previous session, and when Misha finally emerged, his face was pale and his hands were shaking. We walked in silence to the park behind the Kazan Cathedral, finding a bench where we could speak without being overheard. The October air was sharp with the promise of winter, and fallen leaves crunched beneath the feet of other citizens hurrying home to warm apartments and carefully managed lives. "She knows," Misha whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of wind through bare branches. "She knows about the student meetings, about the notebooks, about everything." My heart stopped beating for what felt like several seconds. How much does she know? She has Victor's confession. Names, dates, locations. She knows we attended the Thursday meetings. She knows about the samizdat literature. She knows about our memorization project. The words fell like weights into the cold air between us. Our worst fears had been confirmed. The careful world of whispered poetry that we had constructed over months of cautious trust had been completely exposed to official scrutiny. "What did you tell her?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Misha's shoulders shook, and I realized he was crying, not the dramatic tears of adolescent emotion, but the quiet, desperate crying of someone whose world is ending around them. "She said they already knew everything," he whispered. "She said my cooperation would be noted favorably when sentences were determined. She said refusing to help the investigation would be considered evidence of continued counter-revolutionary attitudes." I felt the world tilting beneath me, familiar certainties dissolving like sugar in hot tea. "Misha, what did you tell her?" I gave them Marina's address, Victor's contact information, the location where we held meetings. His voice broke completely. "I told them about your notebook, about the poems your grandmother taught you, about everything." The betrayal hit me like physical violence, driving the breath from my lungs and leaving me staring at my closest friend as if he had become a stranger. The boy who had shared my hunger for forbidden beauty, who had memorized banned verses with the dedication of a monk preserving sacred texts, had traded our secrets for the promise of leniency from authorities whose mercy was legendary for its absence. But even as anger surged through me, I understood the impossible position Comrade Volkov had created. Misha was 17 years old, facing the possibility of imprisonment that would destroy any chance of university education, career advancement, or normal life. He had been offered a choice between betraying friends and sacrificing himself, and he had chosen survival over loyalty. "I'm sorry," he kept repeating, his words barely coherent through tears and shame. "I was scared. I thought maybe if I cooperated, they might let us all go with warnings." I wanted to hate him, but looking at his broken face, seeing the destruction of hope and innocence that political terror inflicts on its youngest victims, I found that anger was not the strongest emotion filling my heart. What I felt most powerfully was the terrible sadness of understanding how authoritarian systems destroy not only their obvious enemies, but also the bonds of trust and friendship that make human communities possible. Misha had not betrayed me because he was evil or weak, but because he had been placed in circumstances where betrayal became the only path to survival that he could see. "What happens now?" I asked quietly. "They want you to come in tomorrow morning, early, before school." He wiped his face with the back of his hand. "Comrade Volkov said it would be better if you cooperated voluntarily rather than waiting to be arrested." That evening, I sat in our small kommunalka apartment while my mother prepared dinner and the other families went about their careful routines of survival and mutual avoidance. I did not tell her about the crisis descending on our lives. She could not protect me from the consequences of choices I had made, and knowing about my situation would only expose her to potential complicity charges. Instead, I spent the night methodically preparing for what would come, not destroying the poems from my memory. They were too beautiful and important to lose entirely, but separating them from my personal history, preparing to deny knowledge of their existence if that became necessary for survival. By dawn, I had convinced myself that I could lie successfully enough to escape serious punishment. I would claim that Misha had deceived me about the nature of our literary discussions, that I had believed we were engaged in approved academic research. But as I walked through the gray morning streets toward my appointment with Comrade Volkov, I understood that whatever happened in the next few hours would define the rest of my life. I was about to discover whether the beauty I had tried to preserve was worth the price I would be asked to pay for loving it. The administrative offices of school number 47 had never seemed as sinister as they did that gray October morning when I reported for my interview with Comrade Volkov. The familiar hallways, lined with portraits of Lenin and Brezhnev and heroes of the Great Patriotic War, felt like passages in a prison designed to process enemies of the state. Comrade Volkov's office smelled of tea and bureaucratic authority, that particular combination of paper and fear that characterizes Soviet administrative spaces. She sat behind a metal desk covered with files and official stamps. A middle-aged woman whose maternal appearance concealed the calculating mind of someone trained to extract confessions from adolescents who had not yet learned that sincerity could be weaponized against them. "Sit down, Irina Petrovna," she said, gesturing toward a chair positioned to face both her desk and a large window that looked out onto the courtyard where students were beginning to arrive for the school day. "We have much to discuss." The file she opened was thicker than I had expected, suggesting that my activities had been under observation for longer than I had realized. She read silently for several minutes while I sat motionless, trying to control the racing of my heart and the trembling in my hands. "Your friend Mikhail has been very helpful," she said, finally, looking up with a smile that contained no warmth. "He has provided detailed information about your literary activities, your participation in unauthorized discussion groups, your possession of banned materials. His cooperation will be noted favorably in his final evaluation." I said nothing, understanding that any response would be interpreted as either confirmation or resistance, both equally dangerous under the circumstances. "You are fortunate, Irina Petrovna, to be dealing with this matter while you are still a minor, while your errors can be attributed to youthful naivety rather than mature political opposition. But that protection will not last forever. In 8 months, you will be 18 and legally responsible for your choices in ways that carry serious consequences." She leaned forward, her voice taking on the tone of an aunt offering helpful advice rather than a state security officer conducting a criminal investigation. "I am prepared to recommend that you receive educational rather than punitive measures, provided you demonstrate complete honesty about your activities and complete cooperation with our efforts to understand the scope of this underground network." The offer hung in the air between us, a lifeline extended across waters that could drown me if I made the wrong choice. But I had spent the entire night preparing for this moment, rehearsing the lies that might preserve my freedom. I was deceived, I said quietly, the words feeling like ashes in my mouth. I believed we were engaged in approved academic research. I never knowingly possessed or shared banned literature. Comrade Volkov nodded as if my response had been entirely predictable, then opened another file and began reading passages that made my heart sink with recognition. When a man dies, his portraits change. His eyes look differently, his lips smile a different smile. She looked up at me with raised eyebrows. These are the words you recited to a group of university students on March 15th. You claimed they were poems your grandmother had taught you. Were you deceived about the source of these verses as well? The trap was perfect and inescapable. Victor's confession had provided not only names and dates, but specific quotations that proved I had possessed extensive knowledge of banned literature. My prepared lies crumbled before the weight of documented evidence. The poems, I began, then stopped. How could I explain the complex truth about preserving cultural memory without incriminating myself further? Your grandmother, Elena Dmitrievna, was investigated in 1953 for possession of religious materials, Comrade Volkov said, consulting yet another file. No charges were filed, but the investigation remains in her permanent record. It appears that counter-revolutionary attitudes may be hereditary in your family. The revelation that my grandmother had been investigated for her private faith hit me like physical violence. All my life, she had seemed like a gentle old woman who told stories and recited poetry, not a person who had survived official scrutiny for her beliefs. But now I understood that her careful preservation of banned verses was not innocent nostalgia, but conscious resistance. I loved her, I whispered, the first completely honest words I had spoken since entering the office. She was a good person who had lived through terrible times. She remembered beautiful things and shared them with me because she thought beauty mattered. Comrade Volkov made notes in my file, her pen scratching against paper with the sound of a life being officially documented and categorized. Beauty that undermines social stability is not beautiful, Irina Petrovna. Beauty that serves the people builds our collective future. The verses you have memorized serve only to glorify individualism and bourgeois sentimentality. She was wrong, and we both knew she was wrong. But her wrongness was backed by the full power of the Soviet state, while my knowledge of truth was backed by nothing more than the conviction of a 16-year-old girl who had learned to love forbidden words. "What do you want from me?" I asked finally. "Complete cooperation," she replied. "Names of everyone who participated in your literary activities. Detailed descriptions of the meetings you attended. Information about how banned materials were obtained and distributed. Your help in identifying other students who may be engaged in similar activities." The demand was comprehensive and devastating. She wanted me to become an informant against my friends, to betray the network of whispered knowledge that had sustained us through months of intellectual hunger. "And if I refuse, then you will be processed through adult criminal procedures when you turn 18. Possession and distribution of anti-Soviet materials carries sentences of 3 to 7 years in corrective labor camps. Your university applications will be rejected. Your internal documents will carry permanent notations that will affect your employment opportunities for the rest of your life." The choice she offered was no choice at all. Betray friends and principles to preserve personal freedom, or accept destruction in defense of loyalties that might not be reciprocated. She was asking me to make the same impossible decision that had broken Misha's spirit and turned him into an informant, against his closest friend. But as I sat in that sterile office, surrounded by the apparatus of ideological control, I found myself remembering not the fear and pain of recent months, but the joy I had experienced when first discovering the power of authentic literature, the feeling of recognition when reading verses that captured truths I had felt but never heard expressed. "I need time to consider your offer," I said finally, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. Comrade Volkov frowned, clearly expecting either immediate capitulation or defiant refusal rather than a request for delay. "Time for what purpose, Irina Petrovna? The evidence against you is conclusive. The choice you face is simple: cooperation or consequences." "I need to understand what cooperation means," I replied, though that was not the real reason for my hesitation. The truth was that sitting in her office, facing the concrete reality of state power deployed against teenage literary enthusiasm, I had experienced a moment of clarity about what I actually valued most deeply. The poems I had memorized were beautiful, not because they were forbidden, but because they were true. They captured aspects of human experience that official literature ignored: the complexity of love, the reality of suffering, the persistence of hope in circumstances designed to crush hope entirely. "Very well," Comrade Volkov said, closing my file with a gesture that suggested infinite patience backed by infinite power. "You may think until tomorrow morning, but understand that delay will not change the fundamental nature of your situation." I walked home through streets that seemed transformed by the knowledge that I was living through what might be my last day of freedom. The familiar sights of Leningrad, the Baroque facades along Nevsky Prospect, the canals that reflected gray sky and golden leaves, the crowds of citizens moving through their carefully regulated lives, appeared to me as if I were seeing them for the first time or the last time. At our kommunalka, I found my mother preparing dinner while listening to the radio news about agricultural achievements and international solidarity. She looked up when I entered, her face registering concern at my expression. "Are you feeling well, little dove?" she asked, using the endearment my grandmother had favored. "You look pale." I almost told her everything then: the underground literary circle, the investigation, the impossible choice I faced between betrayal and destruction. But what purpose would confession serve except to burden her with knowledge she could not act upon? "I'm tired," I said instead. "School has been demanding." She nodded and returned to her cooking, but I could see in her movements the heightened awareness of someone who recognizes the signs of trouble even when its specific nature remains hidden. That evening, I walked alone through the city center, past the Winter Palace where the revolution had begun, past the Peter and Paul Fortress where political prisoners had been held for centuries. The weight of history seemed to press down on the cobblestones and bridges, reminding me that the choices faced by individuals like myself had been shaping the character of our nation for generations. At the Neva embankment, I stood watching ice beginning to form along the edges of the river that had carried siege survivors through 900 days of starvation and bombardment. The city that surrounded me had survived worse things than literary censorship, had endured greater threats than underground poetry circles. But survival had required sacrifices of principle, compromises with power, adaptations that gradually transformed the character of those who made them. I thought about Misha, who had chosen cooperation over resistance and would carry the burden of betrayal for the rest of his life. I thought about Victor, serving 3 years in a labor camp for the crime of loving banned poetry. I thought about Marina and the other students who had scattered when their network was exposed. But most of all, I thought about my grandmother Elena, who had preserved beautiful words through decades of repression, not because preservation was safe, but because she believed certain truths were worth the risk of knowing. She had passed those words to me not as rebellion against authority, but as gifts too precious to let die with her generation. Standing by the dark water of the Neva, watching the lights of the city reflect like scattered stars on the moving surface, I understood what choice I would make in the morning. Not because I was brave or principled, but because I had learned something about the nature of beauty that made betrayal impossible even when betrayal offered the promise of safety. Some things, I realized, are more important than survival. Not many things, but some. The poems I carried in my memory were among them. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I lay in the narrow bed I had occupied since childhood, listening to the familiar sounds of our kommunalka settling into uneasy rest, the Petrovs arguing in whispers about money, old Mikhail Ivanovich coughing in the rhythm of emphysema, the radiator pipes clicking and groaning with the irregular heat that marked Soviet apartment buildings throughout the city. But instead of finding comfort in these familiar sounds, I heard them as if for the last time. By tomorrow evening, I might be in a detention cell awaiting transfer to wherever 16-year-old enemies of the state were processed for correction or elimination. In the hours before dawn, I performed a ritual that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. I went through my memory systematically, visiting each poem I had preserved there, saying farewell to verses that had sustained me through the gray months of ideological conformity. Akhmatova's Requiem, with its memorial to the victims of Stalin's terror. Mandelstam's verses about the nature of poetic truth. Pasternak's passages about individual consciousness surviving collective oppression. I did not try to forget them. That would have been impossible and pointless. But I tried to release them from the burden of preservation, to free them from the responsibility of justifying whatever consequences my choices might bring. They had given me joy and insight and connection to truths larger than approved ideology. That gift was complete in itself, regardless of the price I might be asked to pay for receiving it. At 7 o'clock, I dressed in my school uniform for what I knew might be the last time and walked through the gray October morning to my appointment with Comrade Volkov. The streets were filled with citizens beginning another day of careful survival, workers queuing for buses, students hurrying to avoid tardiness marks, babushkas lining up outside state stores for whatever goods might be available. None of them could know that among their number walked a 16-year-old girl who had decided to refuse cooperation with state security rather than betray friends who had shared her love of forbidden beauty. Comrade Volkov was waiting in her office with my file already open, a cup of tea cooling beside her elbow as she reviewed the documentation of my criminal literary activities. She looked up when I entered, her expression suggesting confidence that I had spent the night reaching the only rational conclusion possible. "Have you reconsidered your position, Irina Petrovna?" she asked. "Yes," I replied quietly. "I have decided that I cannot provide the cooperation you have requested." Her eyebrows rose slightly, but she showed no other sign of surprise. Perhaps she had dealt with enough stubborn adolescence to recognize the signs of principled refusal. "I see," she said, making notes in my file. "And you understand the consequences of this decision?" "I understand them as well as anyone can understand consequences that haven't happened yet." She nodded and continued writing, the scratching of her pen against paper documenting the end of my childhood and the beginning of whatever would come next. "There are procedures that must be followed," she said finally. Your case will be referred to the appropriate authorities for adult processing when you reach 18. Until then, you will be suspended from school pending further investigation. Your internal documents will reflect your non-cooperation with state security. You will not be permitted to apply for university admission. The words fell like stones into still water, each one carrying implications that would ripple through the rest of my life. But sitting in that sterile office, facing the full weight of Soviet bureaucratic power deployed against teenage literary enthusiasm, I felt not the crushing despair I had expected, but something closer to relief. I had made my choice. The uncertainty was over. The months that followed my suspension from school passed in a strange suspension of normal time. Without classes to attend or homework to complete, my days stretched like gray wool across the approaching winter. My mother asked few questions about my sudden absence from school, accepting my explanation about administrative difficulties with the stoic patience of someone who had learned not to probe too deeply into troubles that might infect her as well. I found work in a textile factory on the outskirts of the city, joining the ranks of Soviet citizens whose labor built the material foundation of our socialist society. The work was mindless and exhausting, 12 hours a day feeding fabric through machines that transformed raw materials into products for export to fraternal socialist countries. But the monotony provided a kind of peace, a respite from the intellectual intensity of recent months. My fellow workers were mostly women whose own educational opportunities had been limited by war, politics, or simple bad luck. They accepted my presence without curiosity, understanding that young people sometimes found themselves in industrial jobs for reasons that were better left unexplored. But I discovered something unexpected during those months of physical labor. The poems I had memorized remained vivid in my mind, perhaps more vivid than when I had been actively studying and discussing them. During the long hours of repetitive work, lines of verse would surface unbidden, providing commentary on my circumstances that no approved ideology could offer. Akhmatova's words about surviving impossible times, Mandelstam's verses about the persistence of truth in the face of official lies, Pasternak's passages about individual consciousness maintaining its integrity even under conditions designed to crush independent thought. The poems had not betrayed me by bringing consequences I had not wanted. They had sustained me through those consequences, offering proof that beauty and truth could survive even when their preservation required sacrifices that sensible people would never make. News of my former friends reached me occasionally through the networks of whispered information that connected all Soviet institutions. Misha completed his final year of secondary school with exemplary grades and appropriate ideological attitudes. His cooperation with authorities noted favorably in his internal documents. He was accepted to Leningrad State University to study approved literature, his future secured by his willingness to trade friendship for safety. I felt no anger toward him anymore. The boy who had shared my hunger for forbidden poetry had been crushed by pressures too great for his 17-year-old spirit to bear. The man he was becoming would carry the weight of that crushing for the rest of his life, and perhaps that burden was punishment enough. Victor was released from the labor camp after serving 18 months of his 3-year sentence, his cooperation with authorities having earned him early release and restoration of most civil rights. Marina had disappeared entirely, perhaps to her grandmother's village in the Urals, perhaps to some other location where former participants in underground literary circles could rebuild their lives under new identities. The network of whispered knowledge that had sustained us through the winter and spring of 1976 was gone, scattered by the same forces that had scattered countless similar networks throughout Soviet history. But I understood now that such networks were not ends in themselves, but means of preserving something more essential: the human capacity to recognize truth and beauty even when recognition carried devastating risks. As winter deepened and the anniversary of my grandmother's death approached, I realized that my own story was becoming part of the larger story she had tried to teach me about the persistence of forbidden knowledge. I was no longer simply someone who had learned banned poetry from a beloved relative. I had become someone who chose to preserve that poetry despite consequences that sensible people would avoid. On the shortest day of December, 8 months before my 18th birthday and whatever adult consequences awaited me, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. Instead of waiting passively for the state to determine my fate, I would begin actively seeking others who shared my understanding of why forbidden literature mattered enough to risk everything for its preservation. Not through dramatic gestures or organized resistance, but through the patient work of identifying kindred spirits and sharing with them the verses that had sustained me through the darkest months of my young life. The same work my grandmother had done in her time, passing dangerous beauty from one generation to the next through the ancient technology of human memory and human courage. I was 16 years old, suspended from school, working in a textile factory, facing prison when I reached legal adulthood. By any rational measure, my life was ruined beyond repair. But in my heart and mind, I carried poems that had survived decades of repression and would survive decades more. As long as someone remembered them, as long as someone was willing to whisper them in the darkness to those who hungered for authentic words, the beauty they contained could never truly die. And I had learned something else during those months of consequences and factory labor. The price of preserving forbidden truth was high, but the price of abandoning it was higher still. Some things were worth more than safety, more than comfort, more than the approval of authorities who would never understand why poetry mattered enough to sacrifice everything else. Standing in the gray December light of Leningrad winter, I understood that my grandmother's legacy was not the specific poems she had taught me, but the willingness to choose beauty over safety, truth over convenience, authentic knowledge over approved ignorance. I was no longer simply Irina Petrovna, the schoolgirl who had stumbled into dangerous literature through curiosity and family memory. I had become someone else, a keeper of forbidden words, a link in the chain of human transmission that connected past and future across the wasteland of political repression. The poems I carried would survive me as they had survived those who taught them to me, and perhaps someday, in circumstances I could not imagine, they would sustain someone else through the gray months of their own choosing between silence and truth. That knowledge was worth everything it had cost, and everything it would cost in the years to come. In the end, that was the only choice that mattered. Not between safety and danger, not between cooperation and resistance, but between living authentically in a world that punished authenticity and accepting the spiritual death that came with complete submission to official reality. I had chosen authenticity, and despite all the pain that choice had brought, I would choose it again. The poems were safe, the truth they contained would endure, and somewhere in the darkness of Leningrad winter, other young people were perhaps making similar choices, carrying similar burdens, preserving similar beauty for transmission to futures that would honor what we had risked everything to save.
You've been listening to The Sleeping Archive. Sleep well. History will wait.